All right. Thanks. Well, thanks everyone for joining in today. This is really great. I'm excited to be a part of this group, and thanks for tuning in and listening and spending some of your day to talk about some astrobiology. So hopefully we can have some good back and forth and discussion afterwards. Um, Once we get through some of what I've been doing, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and about my research, specifically in the astrobiology realm. So I am a planetary scientist. I'm currently based out at NASA's Ames Research Center out in California. Right now I'm actually sitting at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I'm working this year on the East Coast. I'm sitting at NASA Goddard, and I'm also working at NASA headquarters. So I'm doing a little detail assignment this year, but I still get to do research, which is really great. And what I have focused my research portfolio on over the past decade plus is really trying to address the fundamental questions of whether there could possibly be life beyond our home planet Earth, and also working to try and enable humans to be able to explore and to hopefully live off planet one day. So those are sort of the two high-level research themes that I've tried to focus my work on. And when I go about my research, I really take a three-pronged approach to how to address these questions. First, number one is looking at spacecraft data. So that's one way that we can try and address some of these very important and outstanding questions. So a lot of my work focuses on analyzing data that we get back, primarily from Mars. I focus on Mars and also the Moon. But for the astrobiology aspects, Mars is really, really key, and my work has focused on looking for recent water on Mars. So I'm interested in where could there be liquid water today or in the recent past. And that's interesting not only for the evolution of the planet and understanding the geology and the hydrology, but also because we need to follow the water, as the Mars exploration program does, to try and see where there could be habitable abodes for potential life. So I, in particular, have focused in the past looking at the Martian gullies. This is some of the best evidence that we have for recent water on the surface of Mars. And there are still outstanding questions of when did the water flow, how much flowed, where did it come from, could it happen again? And so there's been repeat imaging, and it's really, really an exciting field because this is telling us there was probably liquid water on Mars in the recent past, and that also indicates that there could possibly be habitable environments where life could actually take place and survive. So that's interesting. And also I look at the stability of ice on Mars, water ice. And in particular, looking up sort of in the mid-latitudes, mid to higher latitudes where there's ground ice, so ice that's filling those pore spaces underneath the Martian surface. We want to see how deep is the ice, is it in equilibrium, what is its behavior, and also looking in the recent past, the geologic past on Mars, as the obliquity of the planet changes, the higher latitudes and up closer towards the poles get varying amounts of insolation or sunlight that come in. And it could be the case that some of those epochs in the early or recent Mars history could have warmed up those areas such that that ice could have potentially melted and or become habitable. So those are interesting places that I like to look. And also to tie back to the second theme that I really like to address in my work is trying to find, well, how and where could we send humans to live off the planet? And particularly if we're sending humans to Mars, one of the best ways to enable a long-term settlement on Mars is to use in situ resources or resources that are already there. And one of those big resources is water. And so if we can go where there's ice sequestered in the near surface or near subsurface on Mars, that could be a good place to send humans where we could extract ice and actually use it to enable us to stay there for longer periods of time. So these all kind of cross into each other, but that's sort of been the thrust of what I've been doing. I'm looking at the Mars spacecraft data. A second component of my research is doing numerical modeling. So using math and computer programs to simulate physical things that could happen on other planets. So for example, in the case of trying to understand the behavior of water on Mars. So I've written computer code that simulates what happens to that water when it's on the Martian surface. We know that liquid water will simultaneously evaporate, it will freeze. Mars is very cold, Mars has a very low atmospheric pressure, and so water behaves very differently. So, for example, how long could a certain volume of water flow on the surface of Mars? For example, through the gully channels. How much water do you have to flow through there? What will it do? How much will freeze out? Same thing with looking at ice stability. If there's an exchange of that ice between the subsurface and the atmosphere, what's the rate of that exchange? How do those water molecules move? How long will that ice be stable? Will it ever melt, or will it all evaporate away? And we can answer or address a lot of these questions by doing numerical modeling and using computer simulations based on the physics that we know and understand, and then also tied back to the spacecraft data, the observations of what we know, what we see at Mars. So that's sort of the second component of what I do. And then the third component of my research is based on field campaigns. So going to terrestrial analog sites, in particular, going to areas on the Earth that are like Mars. We haven't sent people to Mars yet, but we can go and explore our own planet. And so I tend to go to very remote places that not a lot of people would go to. They're usually hard to get to, but some of the best places for Mars analogs. So I've done research in a variety of different places, which is one of the great perks of my job. I've gotten to see a lot of our own planet by studying Mars, which is very interesting, and I didn't necessarily know that that would happen when I started out on this path. But I did a lot of my thesis work up in the Canadian Arctic. So there are springs that flow through hundreds of meters of permafrost or frozen ground, and there's liquid water that comes out on the surface and flows down into these channels. Very Mars-like, if you're going to have water flowing through, solid frozen ground, how does that actually happen? And then get up on the surface and then flow in sub-freezing temperatures when you think everything would freeze, but you still have liquid water. In the Arctic case, it turns out that there are salt diapirs, or big salt domes underneath the ground. And so if you have salts in your water, that lowers the freezing point, so you can have liquid water at lower temperatures. So it was a nice lesson learned, and we can characterize that entire system. I've also done work in Svalbard, up north of Norway, again looking at spring systems. It's a theme here with liquid water that's flowing in very cold environments, very cold like Mars, flowing through the subsurface and then out onto the surface. I've done field work in Antarctica, which was amazing. Antarctica is an incredible Mars analog. Antarctica is very, very cold, of course, just like Mars. And we go to the dry valleys of Antarctica, which are not covered in ice on the surface. It's dry ground, just like Mars. And it's very, very dry. It's an arid polar desert, just like Mars. So very cold, very dry. Arguably one of the best environments to go to look at these phenomenon. In this case, we're looking at ice and the stability of ice and how does that ice behave. And there are microbial communities living in these very hostile environments. And if they can do it on Earth, what are the physical conditions where they can actually survive? And so we try and characterize what's going on and see if we can find similar environments on Mars. So thinking that, well, if life has figured out how to live in these harsh places on Earth, maybe it has figured out how to do it on Mars too. So we're trying to understand what's going on our own planet. And then also just understanding the ice, the behavior of the ice. How did it get there? How long has it stayed there? Does it evaporate? Does it freeze out seasonally? Does it melt? All of these questions so that we can better understand the physics of how ice behaves in these conditions. And then that will improve our understanding on Mars as well. Some other types of field work that I've done, going to the Atacama Desert. The Atacama is very hot, but it's very, very dry. And so there have been mud flows that have flowed through there that look very similar to flows that we've seen on Mars. So trying to understand in an analogous sense, how does this work in deserts on Earth? How does it work? How could it work in deserts on Mars? And I also have an interest in human exploration as well. In addition to the science and trying to understand where life could live in our solar system and beyond, I'm also interested in helping to enable humans to explore beyond the Earth, to explore and then also to hopefully spend more time there and settle there eventually. So I do things like spend time living in Mars habitats, and I've led a few crews out to the Mars Desert Research Station where we do simulated missions and field campaigns with science and with all of the logistics that go around that and living in a Mars mission constraint for several weeks out in the desert. So you really learn a lot about what it will take to actually go to Mars. And we also incorporate a lot of the exploration techniques into our scientific field work. Because when we send humans to the moon or to Mars or wherever, one of the things that they'll be doing is science. They'll be exploring where they are. They'll be exploring Mars. They'll be exploring the moon. And how do you do that off planet? How do you do that with all the constraints that you have? You have to survive, first of all. So you have, spacesuits, you have limited dexterity, you have maybe limited situational awareness. You can't bring a lot of gear with you. So what are the most important scientific tools that you need How do you make sure that you collect the most scientifically relevant samples, for example, or collect the most important data with your limited time and resources? And so it's a very different problem. So we go out into the field and we test all these different techniques while we're doing real science. And that increases the fidelity of what we're learning because the science matters. We're actually doing real science here on Earth, and we're going to figure out how we're going to do it on these other planets. So we test out, for example, robots. How can you best use robots to help you do science on the Moon or Mars? You can use robots in a lot of different ways. You can send robots before the humans go. They can do reconnaissance. You can send robots with the humans. They can be support systems and help the humans while they're in the field. You can send the robots after the humans leave and do follow-up and collect additional data and do things that the humans didn't have time to do, or that robots might be more efficient at doing. So it's answering these types of questions. How do you talk to a science team that's located back on Earth? If you've got several astronauts out in the field, or out on Mars, or on the Moon, and there's different communications delays in each of those scenarios, so you have to think about that trade space as well. But how do you optimize the science? How do you get the data back? How do you communicate with the science backroom? How do you get recommendations from them and share information back and forth in the most efficient way possible? How do you conduct the mission? What's the mission architecture? So all these sorts of things. And so it's really nice to be able to wrap up these various interests, trying to understand life on our own planet and also off planet, trying to understand, okay, how can we send humans to go out and explore and live off the planet, and do this in the context of some really neat astrobiology science. So that is, in some, sort of the highlights of most of my astrobiology research. I would be happy to take questions and to talk with folks and try and give you more information, talk about any of these topics in more detail. I could talk about them all day, but I don't think we want to do that. So if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them. I see one. Tell us about the analogous environment found on Earth and how resembling are they to Mars? That's a really, really good question. Because especially in the realm of doing terrestrial analog work and field work. Because for the Mars case, for example, there is nowhere on Earth that is exactly like Mars, right? So when we go into analog places, we have to think about what are the aspects of the analog that are most relevant for that particular question that we're trying to answer. So going to different places allows you to answer different questions. So I like the Antarctica case. Mars is very cold and very dry. Antarctica, in the dry valleys, is very cold and very dry. The Atacama Desert is very dry, as Mars is very dry, but the Atacama is very hot, so you have to take that into consideration. The Arctic, I go up to the Canadian Arctic and then also around north of Europe and whatnot. The Arctic is very cold in the winter. In the summertime, it can actually be quite wet. Things melt and it gets a little bit warmer. I've been up there working in shirt sleeve environments and, like a nice spring day. And Mars isn't quite like that, so we have to, then I've gone in the winter before it gets warm. So you just have to sort of look at what you're trying to address and what are the aspects of the analog that you actually need. For example, going to Utah to the Mars Desert Research Station. It's in the desert, so it's very dry. It's also very remote. So it's nice because you don't have a 7-Eleven down the street in case you need to get something. It's like you're on Mars. You can't just run out and get something. Yet there's a town not too far away in case there are any serious issues or emergencies or anything where you need to go out. So there's a safety aspect as well. So it just depends on what the question is and what you're trying to do. And that's always how I go about trying to do these analog studies, is I start out with the question, whether it's a science question or an exploration question, and say, okay, here's the question. Now what part of the analog do I need in order to answer that question? And then I find the location on Earth where it could possibly go. I see some more questions. This is good. Does climate change impact your research at terrestrial analog sites in a negative or positive manner? So for me personally, I haven't addressed climate change. I haven't studied climate change. I have a lot of earth scientist colleagues here at NASA who do study climate change, and so it's a very real and serious issue. But for me, I've gone to most of these locations and just used them in the Mars analog case, so that has been okay. The dry valleys have remained dry. There are changes that are going on. I mean, I mentioned the Arctic is getting wetter, so there certainly are changes, and we do have to think about that when we go to these places, because we need to look at the conditions of the locations where we're doing our research as they are, during the time period, performance period of our project. So we can't ignore it. We have to take it into account, and we have to respond accordingly. Can you tell us a bit about your academic paths and challenges you had to face and how you overcame them? Oh, that is a good question. So my academic path, I did an undergraduate degree in science at a small liberal arts college in central New York called Colgate University, and there I studied astrogeophysics, which is essentially an astronomy and physics degree, and then pile on more chemistry and more geology and get that planetary sense. And that was really great because I got exposed to a wide breadth of scientific disciplines. And also because it was a liberal arts school, I still had to do, humanities studies and whatnot, literature, etc. So I became a more well-rounded person, I think, and learned how to write. We have to still, as a scientist, we still have to write a lot. We have to write our scientific papers and present our material, whether it's, in forums like this or if it's at scientific conferences, colloquia, etc. So just learning how to communicate was really, really useful. After I graduated from Colgate with a bachelor's, then I went to the University of North Dakota and got a master's in space studies. And I went there because I was interested in all things space. And in that program at that time, you had to study not only science, but also space policy and engineering. So I really wanted to get exposed to all of those aspects. So I did that. And then I went out to NASA Ames for a few summers and did the Astrobiology Academy, which some of you may have heard about. There's still an academy at Ames, so that's for third and fourth year undergrads and first year graduate students. And it really gives you an amazing insight into NASA as an institution, because you not only work on your astrobiology research project, but you are also exposed to the other side of NASA, including upper management and strategic decisions and what NASA's doing and sort of the more managerial and bureaucratic side of NASA, but also NASA's partners. So we visited local academic institutions, universities, industry, different companies that were working with NASA. And that was the first time I really got a big picture view of all of the things that NASA does and started to think about how maybe I could fit in with that system. And then after that, I went to the University of Colorado at Boulder and got my PhD in planetary sciences there. And then I went back to NASA Ames. I had a postdoc position. It was then the National Research Council. Now it's the NASA postdoctoral program. I did a postdoc there, and I had stayed at Ames ever since and got hired on as a space scientist. So I didn't necessarily know that path, when I started embarking on this when I was an undergrad, and I just really liked space and astronomy. And so I think part of it is just being open to different opportunities. One of the biggest things, most important things that I did, I realize now, is every summer I did internships throughout college. And so I had the opportunity to not only meet a lot of people, but also be exposed to different aspects of the space program. I mean, I did a lot of things. I worked at the Space Telescope Science Institute analyzing Hubble data. I worked down at Cornell University doing some science. I worked at Space Camp and was a camp counselor, which was awesome. And I went out to Ames, I did that. I spent a summer at Williams College doing astronomy and observational astronomy. So just being exposed to these different aspects of the space program, and that really allowed me to realize, I wanted to work in planetary. I could hone in on what I wanted to do. And also, just as important, realize what you don't want to do. So I think being open to different opportunities and seeking them out is a good way to go. Are you familiar with the white Mars hypothesis, which suggests that liquid CO2 could be responsible for Martian fluvial features? Do you think there's any evidence to support or dismiss the idea? So yes, I'm very familiar with the white Mars hypothesis. This came out a decade plus so ago again. There's a paper, Hoffman wrote a paper about this, and I actually studied this as part of my PhD dissertation. Part of my work was looking at the subsurface conditions on Mars, looking at the pressure and temperature regimes to see if you could indeed sequester aquifers of some sort of fluid to form the gullies. So I looked at water, looked at CO2, various other things, and from the data that we have and some modeling, generated pressure-temperature diagrams for the various locations of the gullies that were identified. Then it was Mars Global Surveyor data. And the short answer, I have some papers in the literature about it, so you can go look them up if you like. But the short answer is that the temperature and pressure regimes just don't support being able to sequester liquid CO2. It just doesn't work. You're just not in the right regime. You can't keep it stable. And then you have other problems, not only sequestering it, but then when it's released on the surface, to try and inform the morphologies that you see, in particular with the gully, since that's where I focus my research. It's very difficult to carve those types of features with an explosive, emission of CO2 coming out. So, I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. It seems to resurface every now and then people look at it, and I don't think that it's one of the front runners. It's just very difficult to do. Do you think it's possible for humans to live on other planets, or do you think there can't ever be another Earth? Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think it's possible for humans to live on other planets. We have sent people to the moon for shorter periods of time. So we had 6 landed Apollo missions, and people have gone. There has been a lot of work that's been done looking at the technology, the operations, etc., for sending people back to the moon and or onto Mars. So I don't think that the technology is going to be the big hurdle. I mean, you have to get the funding and you have to have the political support and the will to do it, unless some other entity or some private entity can actually do it. I don't know about another Earth. Maybe wherever we go will be slightly different. I mean, certainly we need some Earth-like conditions to support our own existence. We need air to breathe, we need water to drink, we have certain pressure regimes we can live under and temperature constraints that humans need to survive. But I think that wherever we go can be a very new and interesting and different place, and that's sort of part of the excitement of going, is the exploration to see, well, what are we going to find? Every time we even send a robotic space mission to Mars, for example, we're always surprised. We have ideas before we send these missions of what we might see, and we design instruments around what we expect and, to try and answer the scientific questions we have. But inevitably, Mars surprises us. And that's part of the excitement of exploring, I think, is to discover what you actually don't know, discover the unknown, and to place what you know into context. So I think that eventually we could, sure. What it will be like, I don't actually know. Is there any serious research going on about silicon-based life forms? That's a good question. I'm probably not the best person to answer that. I'm not as much into the biology end of the astrobiology. I focus more on characterizing the physical and environmental conditions where life could exist and where it does exist. And then I have a lot of colleagues who also come into the field and do the biology end of things. So I would suggest that you ask for a specific astrobiology, talk to an astrobiologist on that, or a special talk, because I'm sure that there are people that would love to address that. I've gone to some talks about that before, so I know it's an area of research and of interest, but I probably won't comment on it too much detail. Yes, and Graham Lau, who is on here, who I also saw you were featured last week on this website, Graham, so that was very nice. Graham is also another NASA Academy alumni, so if anyone's interested in pursuing space exploration, there are multiple NASA academies. It's a really great program that NASA supports at multiple NASA centers to get students in and to get you exposed to NASA and the international space community and allow you to do a great research project while you're at it. And a lot of times your networking through that program can help you in your future career as well. Being a woman in space science, what are the challenges and suggestions for next generation women scientists? Good question. Optional final question, what does she think about Hollywood's take on life on other planets? Okay, so I'll answer both of those. Sure, so being a woman in space science, when I was an undergrad, I was sometimes the only girl in the physics classes. Maybe there was one more, one or two if you're lucky. But I think that as I've progressed in my career, the statistics have gotten better, that there are more women being represented. That said, it's not without its challenges. So my advice is always, to women who are just starting out or who are students or even further in your career, I just made a conscious decision very early on that I didn't care, right? People will judge you, people will say things, it gets competitive, all these different things. That can happen to men or women. And I just decided that I wasn't going to care about that and what people, if people wanted to try and put you down or wanted to say things or say you couldn't do something or, my approach had been, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to do what I'm interested in. because that's what I want to do. And I'm going to do the best job that I possibly can. And I'm going to work hard and I'm going to work smart. And I'm going to help that propel me through. Now, that's not to say you don't have to sometimes promote yourself and let people know that you're doing good things, because that comes with the whole communication aspect. If you just sit in your office and you do the best science in the world, but no one knows about it, then that's not the most productive way to go, because people can't actually collaborate with you and build off what you're doing and take it to the next level. So I think that just each individual person has to decide what their approach will be, and then stick with that and just go forward. Not to say that there won't be challenges and there won't be hard days and things will happen, but if you just stick to your moral compass and keep going forward with the best work that you can possibly do, that will probably serve you well. And about the what do I think about Hollywood's take on life on other planets? I actually have no idea, because I am one of those strange people who does science for a living, but I really don't like science fiction, and I don't like watching those Hollywood movies because it just frustrates me, because they get things that are technically wrong or inaccurate, and I just get angry and I can't watch these movies and I can't enjoy them, so I just don't watch them. So I don't even know what Hollywood is saying about life on other planets, so I guess I'm not the best person to answer that question. Okay, Mars has solid ice of water. Yes, correct. So shouldn't there be liquid water when ice melts when Mars is closest to the sun, at least near the poles? In other words, should we all be surprised that Mars had ancient liquid water, or how expected or unexpected is it? Okay, that's a good question. So correct, there is water ice on Mars today. There's water ice at the poles. There are polar caps. There's also CO2 ice. There's also water ice in the subsurface underneath the ground. So we sent a lander to Mars, the Mars Phoenix lander. It landed in the Martian Arctic. It had a scoop on it, and it dug down to the ice where we expected it to be. So we have pretty direct, knowledge that there is subsurface ice on Mars. We also have orbital data that suggests this, remote sensing data, modeling data. It's pretty well known. So the issue, though, is that even if Mars were to warm up, the atmospheric pressure on Mars is too low to support liquid water. It's about, you have to have a certain atmospheric pressure where water will be stable, and Mars is below that point. So if you had water, if you had a cup of water and you put it out on Mars, it would just boil and evaporate away. It's not stable. So it can't flow on Mars today, which is why these questions of recent water on Mars are so interesting. Because for the longest time, we'd thought you cannot have any liquid water on Mars. Temperatures are too low. Even if they get too high, if they get higher, then the water will just evaporate and not be stable anyway. So it actually is surprising that we're finding that there could have been, liquid water in the recent past on Mars. There's also another more subtle issue when you start warming up the ice on Mars. We've actually done some modeling of this for some previous work. And even if you have ice in the subsurface underground and you warm it up, what happens is that ice warms up. It will often evaporate away faster than that warm front can reach down and warm it up above freezing. So as it gets warmer, the ice evaporates away, and then in the subsurface, where now it's 0 degrees or so, you don't have any ice left, and there's no ice left to melt. So there are many layers of complications with getting liquid water on Mars today, and a lot of it stems to the cold temperatures and also the low atmospheric pressure. Let's see. Have you benefited from mentorship in your career? Any advice to seek out the best mentors? Yes, it's incredibly important to have a good mentor. That was key for me, and actually I met my best mentors, I think, through the NASA Academy program, because I went and I spent a summer at Ames, and it was thrilling and exciting, and I started working on research projects that I continued on and ultimately came and ended up being part of my PhD thesis, and then my postdoc, and then my work after that. So it's really important to work with someone who actually is doing something that you're interested in, first of all. So because if you don't have the interest and motivation to do this type of work, then it's very difficult to survive, because it's a lot of work. It can be long hours. It's not always easy. So you have to do something that's interesting to you, but then also have your mentor be able to spend the time that they need with you to explain things to you and to teach you things. And also walk that fine line between, helping you out, but also letting you figure it out on your own. Because ultimately, if you're going to be a scientist and have a career, you're going to have to come up with these projects on your own. You're going to have to execute these projects on your own and be able to think through these things. Not to say you won't work with other people and work in teams and collaborate, but you really have to learn how to be a scientist. Come up with these ideas and come up with a hypothesis and come up with a plan to test it. So having a good mentor is really great. And when I take students on now, I always tell them we're going to do something this summer that's of interest to you. I want to make sure that this is productive for you. And I encourage them, during your time, you're going to spend 10 weeks at NASA. So take advantage of that and go to seminars. Go to any seminars you want. You don't have to ask me. Go, even if we're in science, go to engineering seminars if you're interested, or go meet with people. Like, take the opportunity to expand your horizons and network and really figure out what it is that you want to do. Because I think that's, once you reach that, once you see that, then that's how you're going to be able to go forward in your career. If there's life on Mars, do you think it's necessary to find life prior to sending humans to avoid the doubt of contamination, tainting future discoveries, or is this a non-issue? It's not a non-issue, it's a very important issue. It's a very important planetary protection issue. Planetary protection has forward contamination issues where we don't want to contaminate Mars. We don't want to bring Earth bugs to Mars and have them get there and take over. So there are actually identified special regions on Mars, which are primarily these areas where we think there could have been relatively recent liquid water activity that have very stringent controls on what can actually go there, bio controls for if you're sending any equipment there, etc. And then there's also back contamination, right? If Mars did have life, we may not want that to be entering into, say, the habitat or having the humans be exposed to that, etc., etc. So we are doing our best due diligence to try and address both of those questions. The tricky thing to think about, though, is that it's very difficult to prove the null hypothesis, right? So it'll be very difficult for us to say there is definitively no life on Mars, because we just physically can't check every single possible place where there could be life. What we can do, though, is go to those places where they have the best chances of having life and thoroughly explore them to try and lower the trade space there and try and address this issue. So that's what NASA is trying to do, identify these areas that have the highest biologic potential, and we can focus our efforts there. And then put in place protocols for exploring those areas or staying out of those areas or only exploring robotically. There's a whole set of permutations. So there's a whole program on planetary protection at NASA. There are multiple people and institutions working on this, multiple committees, etc. It is a big deal. And is being addressed very seriously. What's your average workday like as an astrobiologist? One of the nice things about doing astrobiology science is that every day is different. It just depends on what work needs to be done. So I do so many different things. It can be writing up scientific papers. It can be analyzing data on my computer. Maybe it's, I've got some lab data that I have to look at. I have some XRD samples that I have to categorize. I got some spectra that I have to look at and analyze. Sometimes it's in front of my computer. Sometimes it's making, putting talks together, making PowerPoint slides. Sometimes it's in the lab doing analysis. So I have samples from the field sites that I have to run in the lab. So doing that work. Sometimes I'm in the field, so that's fun. Sometimes I'm on a plane going to the field. Sometimes I'm running around storage sheds and trying to, pull together all the equipment that I need to go somewhere. Sometimes it's just doing analysis. Sometimes it's doing budgets. I got to pay the bills too, right? So there's that part. Sometimes it's writing proposals. Sometimes it's visiting schools and giving talks. So it just depends on what has to happen. So it's nice in that, there's no set hours per se. I don't have to clock in and clock out. But on the other hand, I think I end up spending more time actually doing work than if I did clock in and clock out. So that's one of the nice things that I like about this job, is that I'm not just sitting in front of a computer every day. There's actually some variety and some different things to do. You're clearly very busy. How do you balance your research funding with being a parent? Yeah, so that's very interesting and fun. I've found I have two young children now, and I have become much more efficient during the workday because I can't stay until midnight like I used to all the time, right? I have to go home at a reasonable time. So I'm much more efficient during the day, and so I find that I don't, stand around the water cooler and chat quite as much as maybe I used to. And it's amazing. I always wonder if I had been this efficient for my whole career, how many more papers I would have written, right? But when you really have, your hours are more constrained and you actually have to work a more constrained, more realistic day, then you can still fit more in, and you prioritize. What is the most important thing that has to be done. And I've been able to build up my teams more too over the years. So now I can have more help, and I have deputies on certain projects, and other team members who can also help with some of the work. And that's also good because that helps train new people and bring up the next generation, and so that's all good. I'm interested in pursuing the biology part of astrobiology and PhD, but I don't have a biology background after high school. I'm now doing a master's in space science and technology. Is it possible for me to do that? I'm really interested to do the biology part. Well, sure. I mean, why not? I know people that have, changed careers, relatively late in their lives, and they're thriving and doing well. If it's something you're passionate about, if it's something you're interested in, and you're willing to do the work and put in the time, then sure. Look into the programs and see what their requirements are. You probably will have to get more of a background. But yeah, sure. Why not? And especially if it's your passion, then I would say go for it and do what's realistic for you. Can you tell us a story about some off-nominal event during a field campaign? Sure. There was an embarrassing one once, which was kind of silly, but we were at the Mars Desert Research Station, and of course we had a film crew that day because they were doing a documentary about Mars exploration and whatnot. Sure, come follow us, that's fine. So we're in our spacesuits and we're all geared up and we're going to go collect samples, and we just had, little Whirlpack, just sample bags, and you just open them up and you put the sample in, the rock, the dirt, whatever it is, and then you close them back up. Easy. I've done it in the lab a million times. I've done it on the field a million times. But when we're doing our simulated Mars missions, we're wearing the whole spacesuits with the helmets, with the gloves, everything. And so we get out into the field and this whole film crew is ready to film us, and we're going to take this sample. And there were two of us, and we could not get the sample bags open for the life of us because we had these gloves on, and these giant gloves, these EVA gloves, and we didn't think about it beforehand, and we weren't going to be able to open up this little plastic bag, and it was I don't know, it was just very embarrassing because we spent hours, getting different tools, and something you would do in 2 seconds, with just your hands. It's like opening a Ziploc bag. It's not that hard. But it is that hard when you have EVA gloves on and you're trying to do that out in the field, and you've got a film crew who is just waiting to get this great shot, and there's nothing you can do, and you can't break sim because that's part of the reason you're there, and so what are you going to do? And then there's also, other things, flat tires in the Outback of Australia. You're driving through and there's no towns and you get a flat tire, and that's always fun. There's things like that. And that's just par for the course for going out in these different places. One time we were coming back from Antarctica in the helicopter and we got caught in whiteout. That was a little scary actually. And so we had to land, in the safest place we could, wait it out. Of course, we had gear with us so we could sleep in the helicopter if we needed to and whatnot, but really wanted to get back to McMurdo. So things like that happen, and that's just, that's just part of doing field work, especially when you're going to these very remote locations where different things can happen. You just have to be prepared, plan accordingly, and figure it out when you're there. Would you volunteer to travel into space if you had the opportunity? It's a good question. I used to think I wanted to be an astronaut, but then I started going down this path of research, and I realized that there was so much work that needed to be done on the ground, on Earth, first, that I have been actually quite content with doing the astrobiology and the human exploration and the robotic research here on Earth. So I'm not clamoring right now. I'm quite happy where I am. Their opportunities today are rather limited for astronauts and astronaut selections, but there are people that still do it, and I think that that's great. And I work with them. We have astronauts on our teams and whatnot, and they're fantastic people. But for myself personally, I think I'm pretty happy where I am. What are your favorite resources to help introduce students to astrobiology? Well, SaganNet is a great resource, and I'm going to refer all my students to SaganNet. I also had been teaching an introductory planetary science and astrobiology course out in California. And so I have a lot of my lectures that I use when I have students that come in. And so I'll walk them through sort of the background and some of the science behind astrobiology. So that's great. And also, we really like to encourage students and teachers to participate in our field campaigns. So we have a program called Spaceward Bound, so you can Google that and look it up. And we actually bring students and teachers out into the field with us to embed them with the science teams, so they get hands-on training. And it's great for the students who are potentially interested in pursuing this sort of work as a career. And it's great for the teachers because they learn so much and they bring it back to their classrooms, and you really get a good return on the investment there, because then the students become interested, and then we can have follow-up activities with the students and web seminars and visits to the classrooms and whatnot. So doing those types of activities are really useful. So if you go online, you can try and look some of those up. What do you think are the next major steps in our exploration solar system and beyond? Well, we need a rocket and a vehicle that will get us there. And so I am indifferent as to how we actually get there, whether it's NASA, whether it's private industry. I'll basically take any ride I can get if we're going to send humans to the moon or to Mars. I'll take either one at this point. So I think we just need to advance the technology so that we can actually do it and make it not cost prohibitive, so that we can actually start sending people on a regular cadence. And I think once we build up sort of a more regular routine in doing this, that will really, really help jumpstart our settlement ambitions. It's sort of like how we study Antarctica, right? There's a base there, there's some infrastructure there. You can go there, you can fly there, and then you can go out from that base. So that might be one model for how we would actually go about, doing some exploration of the moon and or Mars, to sort of build up some infrastructure and then expand out from there. You spend a lot of time as a scientist at NASA headquarters. Why? Yes, that's a good question. Why spend time at NASA headquarters? So what I'm doing right now is spending part-time working in NASA's Science Mission Directorate, working on the Research and Analysis Program. So this is where all the grants to scientists come from. So scientists write proposals. They write out all of the great research they're going to do, their hypotheses, how they're going to do it, the methodology, or what they're going to learn, and they send these proposals into NASA, and NASA evaluates those proposals and then funds the highest rated, or selects proposals based on the science and the programmatics and whatnot. And so I'm working on that program, and it's great because I get insight into that program, but also I can help the community as well. So we can make sure that we're funding this high quality science, at a good rate, and make sure that this research gets done. So I've got one foot this year, one foot in the program management side of things, and then the other foot still in the science world. And it's great, so I can help represent science interests into the RNA program as well. Anything you could share about the Europa mission? No, not beyond the fact that it's super exciting and is so exciting for astrobiology. There are some calls out right now. There's some instrument calls that are out. The mission planning is going forward. And Europa was actually one of the first projects I worked on when I was out at Ames. And it's fascinating. I have a lot of colleagues and friends who work on Europa in the liquid water, and also Enceladus now as well. So there are some really important astrobiology targets in the outer solar system. So I'm glad to see those being folded into the fold. Are you involved in any of the future Mars missions? Not particularly. So MAVEN is going on right now and is really answering a lot of questions about atmospheric escape, loss, where did the water go on Mars, also looking at magnetics and whatnot. And then there will be the future, like the Mars 2020 rover, where that's being formulated right now. So I'll probably work with data that comes back from those, just like we work with data that comes back from Curiosity that's on Mars now. Still working with data coming back from MER, which is still going on, the Mars exploration rovers, Mars Phoenix, etc. So it's part of the first fold of my work, that first bullet, which was spacecraft data analysis. And so the data that comes back from those will certainly be folded into the research. Okay. I don't see any other questions. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, everyone, for all of these great questions. What are your opinions about terraforming Mars someday in the distant future? Is this a good, terrible idea? I think it's a really interesting idea. There's been some really interesting work that's been done on terraforming. One of my mentors at Ames, Chris McKay, has been one of the leaders in doing the modeling and doing the thinking and doing the work about terraforming. And it's a really fascinating idea that it could actually be possible, that you could actually do this. And he's had several students that have been working on different ways of doing it. Super greenhouse gases, for example, is one idea. And I think it's really nice if you think about, if we terraform Mars, we can make it more amenable to life, which is great, and spreading life in the solar system. So I think that's a bit off, far off, in the future for now, but it's fascinating to think about. Okay, so to close up, any words of wisdom for young astrobiologists? So my closing words of wisdom are to follow your passions, right? Don't let anyone else tell you what you can or cannot do, because if you decide you want to do it and you put in the effort, then you can make it happen. That's not to say that there won't be challenges along the way. It's not always easy. You have to work hard. You have to, go above and beyond and kind of set yourself apart. But if you continue to do good research, think about good science, find good mentors, get into a program that will actually try and get you on a path towards where you want to go, and realizing that you may not know where you want to go. The path may open up to you as you learn more and you gain more experience. So take advantage of doing things like internships or volunteering at museums or just anything that can get you exposed to what's out there. Because what I found is I didn't even know what was available to me. I didn't even know what the options were. I just knew that I like space, and then by going out and trying to, try different things, you'll find out what you like and what you don't like. Well, thank you so much for setting up this chat. This has been really, really fun, and I hope to interface with some of you again.